So, why is ESF working with these students from WPI? WPI is a university in Massachusetts in the United States. It's primarily a STEM university, and these students are part of a third-year opportunity to be part of a project whereby they travel overseas and do a project-based learning. And the university is very much a world leader in project-based learning. And their data shows that that experience is life-changing for their students, and that their project work, it matters very much to employers. So ESF has had a relationship with WPI for a number of years, and we have at least one group each year come to work with us, and it's been fabulous for the Emergency Services Foundation. So this particular group were in floods of tears a couple of months ago because, of course, their visit to Australia was curtailed by COVID-19. So we had to put our heads together and think about how they could keep working with us remotely. And I must say they've done a remarkable job. So ESF wanted to investigate women's perspectives on mental health and wellbeing. A couple of things were driving this. First of all, the Beyond Blue research, which pointed to a higher incidence of mental ill health in the emergency services sector, but there was no cohort data of women in that study. Then the study undertaken by Movember actually recommended that a gender lens be put on programs that take place in the emergency services sector. And of course, there is some other research about women's mental health generally, but nothing very much about women in the emergency services sector. So at the outset, we need to acknowledge the limitations of this study. First of all, we've got 4 third-year university students who have never even been to Victoria. They have nothing to do with the emergency services sector, but and they have been working remotely. So it's been incredibly challenging for them. Throughout this webinar, the protocol for questions will be, please use the Q&A, not the chat line. I'm managing this all myself, so I've got to keep my eye in 1,000 places, or raise your hand. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can ask the question. But of course, we've only got limited time. So I would like to now introduce our 4 panellists. Alexis, Elizabeth, Krystina and Manon, and I'm going to hand over to them now. And they're in all different parts of the United States. Krystina's in her basement, so you can see her Christmas tree in the background there. But the girls are all over the place. Okay, so over to you girls.
Susan, could you make sure that the screen sharing permissions are properly set, please?
Sorry. There you are. Minor technical issue. Sorry, girls.
No worries. Alrighty, so thank you again to everyone for joining us on our presentation today. Our topic is Breaking Barriers, Changing Lives, Investigating Mental Health and Wellbeing Among Women in the Victorian Emergency Services.
As Susan mentioned, we're 4 students from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, or WPI. It's a STEM-based institution located about an hour from Boston. Our project-based curriculum puts a heavy focus on understanding the world through a different perspective. Part of our curriculum is to complete an IQP, or an interactive qualifying project that addresses the problem that lies at the intersection of technology and science with social issues and human need. It's not necessarily related to our major. Like she said, we were supposed to be completing this work in Melbourne this term. However, we've had to work remotely, and while there have been some limitations, we don't feel that this has altered the quality of our final project. Again, I'm Elizabeth Inger. I'm a biomedical engineering major and a bioinformatics minor, and I'm wicked passionate about this project because I deeply care about medical optimization and feel that it is part of our responsibility to take care of those who help take care of us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Krystina Waters, and I am an aerospace engineering major at Worcester Polytechnic Institute with a concentration in astronautics and a minor in astrophysics. I am passionate about this project because I have had a lot of family members who have suffered with mental health issues, and I know the importance of why we need to address this.
Hello again, my name is Manon Miller. I'm a biotechnology and biochemistry double major. I'm very passionate about this project because I really want to help those that have helped me a lot in my past.
And hello, I'm Alexis Boyle. I'm double majoring in interactive media and in psychology. And I found this project to be a unique experience because I have family members who work in the emergency services. And so I get kind of the inside scoop on all of the struggles that comes with.
So before we go diving deep into our topic, we want to give you a little bit of a synopsis of everything we're going to be talking about today. So first, we're going to be giving you a background on mental health and well-being in Melbourne, Victoria. After that, we're going to go into some of our results from our data collection and analysis over the past 14 weeks. After this, we're going to give you our current and final description of what it's like to be a woman in the emergency services in Victoria. And then finally, we're going to give you a series of recommendations that we feel the ESF and organizations should implement to best support these women and their mental health and well-being.
So like Susan already stated, our project focused a lot on mental health and well-being. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction on what mental health and well-being is and why it's so important. So mental health and well-being is the cornerstone for how someone interacts with the world. It affects someone's thoughts, their actions, and their feelings, whether that be in a positive or a negative way. It also affects how you can contribute to society and how you handle daily stress.
So mental health support is an umbrella term used for any form of help an individual seeks to help them cope with stress or to ameliorate their mental health and well-being as a whole. So there are three main types of mental health support. The first is professional care. So this includes seeing a psychologist, going to a counselor, and taking medication. The second most common type is support networks. So this includes your friends and family and anonymous support groups. The third most common type is coping mechanism. So this includes beneficial ones like exercising or doing your hobbies, but it also includes detrimental ones like alcohol and substance abuse.
So while we were doing our preliminary research before our project term started, just getting an understanding of how things work, one common thing that we found throughout all of the research was that it was commonly reported that first responders often feel as though they have their back against a wall, metaphorically speaking, meaning that whenever they feel they're having issues with their mental health and well-being, there's not really a direct option they can go without potential negatives for going upon a route, whether that is approaching supervisors or professionals for your mental health and well-being, which could potentially cause negative repercussions on your job or volunteer place, or doing the opposite and not going to speak to someone, which could potentially cause your mental health and well-being to further deteriorate. We have the 2018 Australian citizen suicide rates from Beyond Blue, which was a great contributor to our research. And as you can see, the general population typically had a much lower percentage of thoughts and plans than the general total first responder populace with concerning suicidal rates. We also looked further into the first responder population and got the different sector statistics with the SES, police, ambulance, and the fire and rescue. As you can see, each of these sectors also has a much higher rate of thoughts and suicidal plans than the general population.
There are a myriad of factors that contribute to issues in mental health and well-being. Some of these are freestanding, while others are interwoven with others. I'd like to draw your attention to three recurring issues that impact mental health and well-being. One is pressure to act a certain way. This might be to impress a manager or a colleague, maybe if you're trying to receive some sort of recognition or promotion. The next is extensive responsibilities. This might be due to a workload that's unmanageable, seeking to take care of other coworkers, dealing with extreme or unusual emergencies, like transitioning your whole team to working remotely due to a pandemic, or external caring responsibilities, your own hobbies, or if you're trying to pursue something like education on the side. And the final example is workplace bullying. Sometimes this is super obvious and other times it's subliminal. Maybe you're not given the responsibility you think you've earned. Maybe your organization isn't purchasing equipment that's the appropriate size for you as a female, or others in your workplace assuming that you're praised solely on your gender and not for your merits. This can lead to fear of discussing problems and addressing poor behavior that can lead to negative repercussions. One example that a manager told us is how she's struggling with reporting certain situations that she knows are occurring because the victims don't feel comfortable coming forward to give her the information she needs to properly document because the victims feel that there will be too many repercussions and that it's not worth the risk.
So what are these inhibitors that are stopping women from the emergency services from getting the mental health care that they need? So this can be divided into two main categories. The first category is attitudinal barriers. There are 4 different types of attitudinal barriers. The first of these is perceived barriers. So perceived barriers focus on how others perceive you. The next is personal barriers. So this is how you perceive the mental health of others. After that comes self barriers. These are how you perceive your own mental health. And then finally, we have cultural/structural barriers. And this is society's or your organization's view on your mental health and well-being. The second category is structural barriers. So these are more tangible barriers that you'll face in your everyday life. The first of these is finance. So actually having the money to get the care that you need for your mental health. The second of these is time. So being able to juggle your responsibilities and actually have the time to go out and sit down with a counselor or therapist to get the help you need. The next is education. So this is mental health literacy and actually having that knowledge and baseline to understand what help either your employees or you need. And then finally is accessibility. So having access to the required resources in order to have the best support for your mental health and well-being.
So once we started doing research on the barriers present and on the mental health and well-being of those in the emergency services, we found that there was a real lack of information focusing on the women and not a lot on with a gendered lens. When we looked more into this, we found that women make up around 31% of the Victorian emergency service population. You can see the specific makeup of each organization on the right here. And we were surprised that even though they make up around 1/3 of the emergency service population, there wasn't much information that focused in on them. And so because of this, it led us to the focus of our project and ultimately to our actions and our findings.
In describing and addressing mental health and well-being, we first conducted thorough research in the prep term to understand challenges regarding mental health and well-being and how we could gather information that reflects how the women in the sector feel. First, we analyzed a survey conducted by the ESF after their International Women's Day event in March. It allowed us to look at some of the demographics and see how the women felt about mental health and well-being in the sector. We received both qualitative and quantitative data and used a variety of statistical methods and tools to code in order to find statistically significant correlations and repetitive themes and challenges and ideas. We then conducted introductory interviews that were used to understand the current ideologies for females in emergency management, to understand what it's like on a daily basis and to gain some new perspective. We then conducted focused interviews and discussion groups to do a deep dive into the previous themes we found. The information was again analyzed and compiled into a report that will be presented as a booklet to the ESF to understand the needs for women for additional or modified mental health and well-being care. This then allowed us to make some recommendations that we will discuss later on. We will first discuss the details of the results of speaking with 8 women across 6 agencies in Victoria.
So, as Elizabeth mentioned, these introductory interviews were essential for us to begin to understand the framework and get a better understanding of what it's like for women in the emergency services in Victoria as well as in the field. So, although we spoke to 6 different agencies, there were some differences, but for the most part, all the women reported very similar themes and very similar different inhibitors for their mental health and well-being. If I can draw your attention to the word cloud on the left, you'll see that we have varying sized words to represent these different themes. The bigger the word, the more often it was reported by the women. So, for example, work culture, accessibility, community, conversation, and acknowledgement were some of the most common themes that women reported. On the right, we've included some quotes from our introductory interviews that women said. One woman mentioned that mental health literacy was extremely important to be able to foster broader and better conversations on these sensitive topics. Another woman mentioned that working with someone who's not very acknowledging and doesn't understand only creates a more detrimental emotional response and can cause even more inhibitors for these women's mental health and well-being.
Now we're going to go into our analysis of the survey that was distributed by ESF, as Elizabeth previously mentioned. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what the survey contained and why it was sent out / who it was sent out to. So the survey was created by the ESF and stakeholders. It focused on how women within the emergency services sector felt about how their organization handled mental health care and well-being. It was emailed to the International Women's Day Forum attendees and the Australasia Women in Emergency Network. It was also distributed at the ESF's Women's Day event. We had a total of 167 responses, which was very good and representative and provided a variety of data that we could analyze. And we had 14 questions total, 6 demographic, 4 scaled, and 4 free response, which we'll get into the specific analysis of later. We found 3 major categories of findings throughout the survey demographics. The first finding was that there were differences between emergency service roles, meaning the frontline roles or first responders, and the support roles, or those in administration or corporate positions. These 2 different roles had different perspectives on attitudinal barriers within emergency services. The next big finding category that we found was that there are differences between volunteers and paid workers. And then lastly, we found that there was differences within age and the perspectives on mental health and well-being.
So sorry about that. I was having some technical difficulties. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. So, like Alexis said, we did find several statistical differences between the emergency service type and attitudinal barriers reported. So what we found first was that women in frontline roles report more discomfort around mental health and well-being. Specifically, frontline were less comfortable speaking about their mental health to their managers. You can see from looking at the red arrows, frontline make up the majority of those who disagree, but also those who strongly disagree that they feel comfortable. Some reasoning we have after our interviews was that they're exposed to different kinds of stresses and different kinds of traumas, and that their will culture was reportedly more command and control, which leads to greater fears about repercussions and about appearing weak to their managers. Additionally, we also found that frontline report more self-stigma, which is an individual's views about themselves. Particularly, we found that there were high reportings of hero's guilt and a fear of appearing weak, inadequate, or lesser for displaying emotions. We also found that volunteers may struggle the most with this, possibly due to reported feelings of being seen as secondary to their organization, and also reported unequal resources and support.
Support roles report cultural barriers more frequently than those on the front line. A cultural barrier is anything that goes against the traditional ideas or perceptions challenging mental health care and well-being. For example, a woman might feel that it is her job to have it all together for herself. But another example is caring responsibilities that fall more frequently onto women. It is important to note that our survey indicated that over half of the women have external caring responsibilities. This could be for children, their parents, or a disabled family member. This tells us that these concerns associated with balancing these roles as part of their everyday lives is at the forefront of many women's minds. Now, getting back to this graph, as you can see on the bars on the right, of those in paid roles who reported attitudinal barriers, it is more frequently common for those who are in support roles than those who are on the front lines. While there might be confounding variables that might contribute to this, one might be that those who work in support roles tend to involve less exposure to acute stressors and therefore don't associate workplace stressors as mental health or well-being triggers. It is also known that there is more gender discrimination for paid workers in comparison to volunteers. Furthermore, paid support roles report perceived stigmas more than volunteer support roles. Our perceived stigmas are what other people think others might think of them. For example, my coworker might think I can't be trusted if I disclose to them that I have a mental health condition. As you can see on the graph on the right, of those who reported perceived stigmas, those who are paid, which is the red arrow, experience perceived stigmas significantly more than those on the far right, who are volunteers. Those in the middle, the yellow arrow, reported a moderate amount of stigma. But since those in the middle are both paid and volunteers, we have no way to differentiate whether the data they're reporting indicates that the experience of stigma that they've encountered was from a workplace incident or from an incident at their place of volunteer. While many volunteers expressed that they felt that their organizations had a lack of community, they are in the workplace less frequently. Therefore, those who are there full-time come in contact with people more frequently and may have been exposed to harassment to themselves or to harassment to a peer, making them feel that they are more likely to be judged. Therefore, this potentially leads to an increase in the perceived stigmas.
In addition to everything we've just mentioned, we also found that there are correlations between the different age groups and their perspectives on mental health and well-being. So our first thing that we found was that older women have a tendency to prioritize their mental health and well-being more than that of younger women. So if I can draw your attention to the graph, on the far left, you'll see where the red arrow is designating that ages 18 through 25 were more likely to disagree that they did not prioritize their mental health and well-being. Whereas if you look on the right side of the graph where the yellow arrows are designating, ages 51 and up were more likely to agree that they prioritized their mental health and well-being. Another conclusion that we drew from this is that an increase in age correlates with an inclination to seek mental health help earlier. So if we look on the left side of the graph, we'll see that ages 51 and up were more likely to disagree that they did not get help for their mental health and well-being. Whereas if we look on the right side of the graph where the red arrow is designating, we'll see that ages 18 through 25 were more likely to agree that they did not get help for their mental health. So what are the conclusions that we can draw from this? So regardless of role or pay type, Older women may be more confident seeking help for their mental health because they've been in their community for a longer amount of time. They're more comfortable speaking with their managers, and they feel like they have more of a stance in their work culture. We also found that this may be due to the fact that older women might have less caring responsibilities. A lot of their children may be grown and out of the house, and therefore they don't have to worry about balancing as many external responsibilities in addition to their mental health in the workplace.
So now we're going to move on to the free response analysis portion of the survey analysis. There were 4 free response questions, which were open-ended questions looking to gain personal insight from the participants about how they feel their organization handles mental health care and well-being. So the first question that was asked within this free response portion is, what did the participant think stopped women from seeking support when they felt mentally unwell? We separated this into the 2 different barriers that were mentioned earlier, attitudinal and structural, to figure out what they felt was the most hindering. Almost 90% of the participants reported attitudinal barriers, with the perceived barrier being the highest. Now, the perceived barrier, just a refresher, is the one where you don't feel comfortable doing something because of what others may think of you. Now, moving on to the structural barriers, 32% reported them, and the highest were time and accessibility, meaning that these 3 key things, the perceived stigma, the time and accessibility barriers, were the most viewed as hindering to seeking mental health and well-being help in the workplace. So here's a word cloud. As Chris mentioned earlier, the larger the word is, the more it was reported within the answers of the survey. As you can see, work culture, accessibility, control, and weakness were the most reported within this question. The quote here on the right, if I can direct you to it, we felt touched upon the key points of the answers of this survey, talking about how women are weak, which touches upon that perceived barrier, especially considering that the emergency services is a predominantly male workplace, and also touching upon the time and accessibility barrier due to a lot of external care factors, such as a lot of the time being used is also used to take care of children.
So our second free response question asked the women what they viewed to be the most critical issue affecting their mental health and well-being of women in the sector. So of the barriers, we found that around 85% of the respondents reported an attitudinal barrier or a stigma, with the most common being cultural. So just as a quick refresher, cultural barriers are cultural norms or institutional policies that can deter someone's ability or willingness to get help. We also found that around half of the respondents reported a structural barrier, with the most common being time at around 24%. Overall, through this question, we found that work culture is the biggest contributor to mental health concerns. If you look to the quote on the right, many women reported having to do it all, but still have to work extra hard in order to be seen as equal to their male counterparts. Additionally, through the work cloud, you can see that some of the other identified themes, but overall work culture was the most reported, followed closely by control, which is by feeling in control or having autonomy to do what you please, closely then followed by gender discrimination or gender stereotypes, and lastly by a lack of support.
When asked what you would like your line manager to do more of, respondents reported themes that were consistent with looking to improve various facets of work culture, which is defined as the behavior and attitudes of leaders and managers. Women would like to see more acknowledgement, being recognized for what they have to say while also being shown empathy. And women would also like to have more conversations, which is another form of support. Increased education could help with this by combating the command and control culture to increase normalization of these topics, lending to more effective conversations that draw greater attention to interpersonal and emotional intelligence. This improves work culture by building trust, improving relationships and understanding, increasing advocacy and confidence, promoting self-care, and giving additional value to every member in the organization.
The final free response question asks women what their line manager needed to do less of to support their mental health and well-being. If I can draw your attention to the quotes on the right, we have two quotes from two different women. The first woman said that she needed her line manager to ignore her less, be less close-minded, and be less unapproachable. The second woman said that she needed her line manager to make more time to understand how to put in place a positive, healthy process in order to help her through her recovery with her mental health and well-being. The word cloud in the center shows the three most common themes that we found for this question, with ignorance being the biggest. Ignorance has to do with the lack of mental health literacy, and again, that education issue. Understanding, and line managers having more of an understanding of why it is important to talk about mental health and what resources are available to address these issues. Unavailability and preparedness were also two of the most common themes that were reported, which tie again into that access to resources and that education on knowing what to do during these sensitive issues. So putting our heads together in all this data that we found over the past 14 weeks, we found that mental health literacy and interpersonal intelligence are the most important features to foster better mental health and well-being for women in emergency services in Victoria.
So after we completed our survey analysis, we performed some focused interviews and discussion groups, and we're able to create a description of mental health and well-being for the women in emergency services. Our first area to describe was that a proactive organization would promote mental health and well-being. We found that a large portion of the women reported that they wanted their organizations to walk the talk. With the first quote on the right, you can see the frustration of one woman where she said that apparently to the organization, safety is a priority, but she hasn't seen enough support or resource for it. Additionally, the women report that organizations are not sufficiently acknowledging the importance of mental health and well-being, weren't taking enough action to create a better sense of community, and where they felt supported, and they felt that their organizations were not providing sufficient support. What we also found was that a lot of the women wanted their organization to take accountability for the behaviors of the people and the trouble that they're all facing. The team has heard stories from the women where they said situations would be swept under the rug, or how some of the women felt that their organization would be happier just to ignore problems.
So going off of what Manon just stated about how sometimes women within the emergency services feel like organizations aren't necessarily bringing to light issues that should be bringing to light, or treating issues within the sector the way they feel they should be treated. So it's important to note that leadership sets precedence for how the rest of the team responds. So managers get the chance to set the culture for the team. For example, if a manager did an action that was culturally seen as unacceptable but weren't reprimanded for it, that may become more normalized within the sector and then seen more often because the manager was not reprimanded for the action. It's important then for managers and leaders within the sector to instill a culture of appropriation and beneficial conversation, working hard on supporting those with issues instead of shaming or bullying, and providing more acknowledgement and education. That's not to say that these things aren't already happening, as our thorough research proved that mental health and well-being care within emergency services has grown a lot in the past few years. That being said, there is still room to grow further. So one of the big things was that we found managers needed to understand the limits of their people and themselves. Of course, within emergency services, as I don't need to preach to the choir, it become very easy to overwork yourself, as reported, and to bring home the stress and work with you even when you're not on the clock. That being said, we are all only human, and so it's really direly important to make sure to take that step back and remember that your mental health and well-being should be the thing that comes first. As a famous and most popular quote has been used, you can't pour from an empty cup. So making sure to take the step back and take care of yourself and the people around you before you can work yourself further. As unreasonable expectations can lead to guilt for not doing enough or being forced to prioritize responsibilities over mental health and well-being, it becomes very easy to work too hard and have what's a burnout. So making sure to take that step back and breathe and take care of your mental health and well-being before getting right back into the action. So, as I mentioned before, work culture. Work culture plays a large role in the inclusivity of women and the inclusivity of mental health and well-being. So, it was reported that not enough people have sufficient emotional and interpersonal intelligence. That means that whenever there's a sensitive situation, people feel, or people have reported, according to our research, that situations aren't necessarily handled in what they feel is the best way. So not enough people know how to have those beneficial conversations or how to properly offer help. We all have good hearts, I believe, and we're working in the right place. So even if we want to help someone, we might say something that comes across different than we mean it. Even though our hearts are in the right place, it may come across and detriment their mental health and well-being rather than help it. So having that education to learn the nitty-gritty of, say, terminology and such to ensure that our good thoughts are also put into good actions instead of having consequences we may not have considered they have. So bonds and conversations can help eliminate this issue. Say having cups of coffee and talking about deep feelings and being vulnerable and opening up can lead to more acknowledgement and support and more comfort in knowing that you're not alone in the situation and that if something does come across wrong, that you guys have a more tight-knit bond. And so someone who may not be doing well mentally can take that step back and say, I'm close with this person, we've had vulnerable conversations. They may not be needing to say it the way I'm taking it. That could provide to a lot of support and acknowledgement and helping clear up those conversations. This can especially be important whenever people are worried about opening up and being vulnerable, especially if they're worried that they won't be taken seriously. And if they're worried about confidentiality from what they're saying not being there. So people may be afraid of not being supported. And so having these conversations and support will help instill this new culture of acknowledging and being there for each other rather than being scared to open up.
As a result of our findings, we are presenting the ESF and the various organizations a series of recommendations that are thought to be feasible yet impactful. We believe with thoughtful consideration and implementation, they could address some of the most prevalent concerns women have regarding mental health and well-being in the sector. First, the ESF should share this webinar and booklet widely to continue their purpose of supporting, addressing, and promoting the need for mental health and well-being awareness and care utilization. Next, since our findings are in alignment with the work conducted by Beyond Blue, the ESF should continue incorporating that content into their projects. They should also encourage literacy among organizations that not only addresses mental health and well-being from a textbook perspective, for example, symptom identification, but also encourage organizations to have tough conversations and be receptive to the responses, promoting interpersonal and emotional intelligence. Additionally, the ESF should consider exploring how those with external responsibilities can be aided, and this stretches beyond just women. For example, make childcare available for parents who have to complete a mandatory training or have to attend a short notice emergency. We believe this would increase involvement, particularly among volunteers, and this would further promote inclusivity and equality in opportunities for certain cohorts, particularly parents of young children. Furthermore, the ESF should consider bringing women from multiple sectors together for events. This would allow them to share in each other's success stories, learn more about best practices, network, discuss similar experiences, voice issues, build confidence, and create a sense of community. Finally, the ESF should explore how sector-wide thank you events could be generated. One example is making it a community event with a barbecue or lawn games. This would allow young children to view equipment and see people in uniform letting them ask questions and making them feel more assured in the event that they're involved in an emergency. But more importantly, it would allow first responders to see the impact on those they serve and feel appreciated.
So as we mentioned, we also have a series of recommendations for the organizations. So our first recommendation is to consider how mental health and well-being training and development for leaders and managers can give a greater focus on having these sensitive conversations, normalizing the topic, and help to gain a better understanding on individuals' needs, aid in better symptom and fatigue identification, and build that greater sense of community. Our second recommendation is to consider how mental health and well-being training for paid and volunteer workers can give greater emphasis to holistic self-development and personal advocacy. Our third suggestion is to give greater emphasis to promoting personal success stories and resource availability in the workplace. This will help women to gain greater confidence and trust in the support services that are provided to them. Our next suggestion is to provide greater access to external support providers, such as psychologists and therapists. This will help to create confidentiality on these sensitive topics and again increase women's trust in who they're speaking to about their mental health. Our next suggestion is to explore how units and teams can expand team camaraderie. So this is specifically a lot more towards volunteers who mentioned that because they spend less time together, they have less access to opportunities for their mental health, and they have less of that community that they need to feel comfortable getting the support that they need. And finally, our last suggestion is to create forums for women within the same agencies to be able to network with each other, continue building their confidence, voice their concerns and issues, and again, create that better sense of community.
Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, so there's a couple of people have put in questions here, and I have just allowed, I believe, Amanda Smiley to speak. Amanda, can you hear?
Yes, it's a bit unstable. Can you hear me?
Yes. Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much. Thank you, girls. This was a great piece of research. My question really was whether you think there is, in all the discussions you've had with people, is there a single action that managers could be taking today, here and now, that would actually promote positive mental health and support women in emergency services?
Amanda, I'm going to mute you because your line is very scratchy.
Okay.
Girls, would you like to answer?
Yeah, yes, of course. So we definitely saw that acknowledgement is the biggest issue. Some people are really hesitant to have these tough conversations if they don't feel that they're well equipped to respond to something that they may not like hearing. But if they acknowledge it and make the time and just show empathy, women have told us that that would really mean a lot to them.
Okay. There's a lot of questions here, girls. I'm actually going to read them. Amy at Esther has said, I think that this presentation highlights the need for leaders to give permission for authenticity. Being allowed to have good days, bad days, seek assistance and connect independent of hierarchy. Love it. So what do you think about that? You know, the idea of a leader being very authentic. It seems to be what you're talking about. Women are wanting these genuine conversations that are showing emotional intelligence. What's your response to that?
So I'll happily take this question, girls. It would help a lot, according to our research, if managers were more authentic and showed, I guess, kind of they're more human than a perfect manager per se, because having someone who you don't see having mistakes or bad days or relating to personally can make one feel very isolated and even guilty for having human daily problems, which, I mean, we're all human. We all have personal issues and bad days. So being more authentic and having those deeper connections, I would say could really help people in the emergency services.
Okay. Another question is, this is from Sarah Hewitt. This is a great piece of research, especially given the barriers that you had to face. The ideological barriers can be addressed by tackling workplace culture. How do you think the structural barriers can be addressed? The issue of time, being time stretched, feeling overburdened, and juggling care responsibilities.
Yeah, so, do you want to take it, Manon?
No, go on.
Okay. So one thing we thought that especially could be implemented, we brought up the fact that older women might have less caring responsibilities because their children are out of the picture. We were thinking that maybe there could be implemented some sort of service where if a woman receives an emergency call and she needs to leave immediately and she has young children, those responsibilities, there's a program in place where someone will be there to take care of their kids or help them out, or a daycare or somewhere they can take them, so that some of those responsibilities and time is taken off their hands. And Manon, if you want to expand on that at all, feel free.
Yeah, so a big one was having the additional help of caring responsibilities, but another one we found was having too much of a workload. So we feel if managers are more aware of the situation that their employees are in or their volunteers are in, they might know if they're giving too much work, too much assignments. They would know exactly what the level of their employee could manage. Specifically, we've heard a lot of stories where women had too much work and then they had to bring their work home, but then if they have a child, they had to take care of their child, and then they can only continue working on whatever tasks they had once their child went to bed, which then in turn impacted their sleep, impacted their well-being and their mental health. So we feel like Chris said, if there was a system in place or some sort of support network where parents could leave their children during last-minute emergencies or during mandatory training, but also if the managers or leaders were more knowledgeable about how much work a task would require.
Okay, very good. A question here from Faye Bendrups. If there's a high level of ignorance by managers and work culture is an issue, in a sector that is overwhelmingly male, is there a place for positive discrimination to bring more women into leadership roles?
I definitely think that this is a good thing. And many of the women indicated this as well. However, there's some concern that if we're giving too much attention to just women, then men are being neglected, or they feel that they're being neglected. So while this positive discrimination would be beneficial, it's more looking at what do women specifically need? Can we give them resources that equal the playing field? Like we said, they have a lot of caring responsibilities. So can we alleviate some of that pressure from them? And also understanding that based on our research, women are better at symptom identification and are better able to recognize warning signs in themselves. So how can we play off that beneficial, I know I need help, as not a weakness, but as a strength?
Faye also made the comment here, we mustn't forget that older women also have caring responsibilities for elderly parents, and certainly a theme here in Australia is that many grandparents are also looking after grandchildren. There's another question here from Amanda Lamont, and she has asked, I'd be interested to know if the researchers found anything that surprised them in their research, something they hadn't expected.
One of the surprises that I personally had looking through the research was the difference in the age groups and the perspectives on mental health and well-being. Due to how normalization of mental health and well-being has become increasingly popular and more integrated in society throughout the recent years, I figured that the younger age groups would be more normalized and more proactive seeking mental health and well-being care, when in fact it was reversed from what I thought it was, which is encouraging to see the leaders and the more experienced people in the sectors looking to go get mental health care earlier and sooner, and providing a good example for the newcomers and the younger generations, but it was something that surprised me.
Okay. And now did anything surprise anyone else?
I agree. That was definitely one of the biggest ones for me as well. I also was surprised quite a few women we spoke to had even now like a few incidents that even discrimination that was pretty shocking in this day and age. You would think like a lot of that would be more, even that playing field, like Elizabeth mentioned, there would be a lot more respect and equality among the genders. And so that was definitely shocking for me hearing some of those stories.
Okay. There's a question from Phil Green here at Victoria Police. Did analysis include effective help or referral pathways, for example, an agreed point of entry to get the advice or support needed, an employee helpline? I will answer that, Phil, and say that what the students found was that people were often reluctant to speak to people in their own organisation, and they were looking for anonymity. Now, that might change over time when they feel that there's more trust built up through the ability to have conversations. But at the moment, they were looking for anonymity and an external helpline. Would you agree with that, girls?
Yeah, a lot of the women were saying that they viewed a lot of the other employees and workers struggle to talk about mental health and well-being specifically with those that were supposed to help them per se, because they were scared of repercussions if there was a breach in confidentiality or a breach in anonymity. So we did see some women go out to external mental health providers, but then you also had the additional burden of having to finance more of that cost. So we did see a lot of fear for repercussions in the workplace, but also social repercussions.
So what do you think trust looks like? What do you think the women were talking about when they said they want a trusting relationship with their line manager? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So what we discovered whenever we defined trust and the reports of women wanting more trust and support, we kind of dialed that to being able to feel open and honest and displaying faults and flaws and things that aren't necessarily perfect or productive about themselves, but they're still accepted. And even though these things may not be the best features one can have when working in emergency services, they're still accepted and they're still trusted to do their job and do the best they can do at their job, regardless of what they're facing.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit more about what the women said about their fear of disclosing mental health issues and the possible impact on their career?
Yeah.
Go for it, Elizabeth.
So women were concerned about things going on their permanent record and that maybe being shared with someone who wasn't going to keep that a secret if it was meant to be secretive information, private information. Women were also afraid that they would have their weapons taken away or responsibilities reduced or modified, and feeling that they just weren't worthy enough or equal enough to some of their peers that were feeling a little bit mentally more well. And then they were also just fearful that they wouldn't be promoted, seek recognition that they thought they might have earned, and just having coworkers treat them differently, or their managers treat them differently as well.
Okay,
there was also
Sorry, go on, Manon.
And there was also a fear about people not understanding the extent of like how the spectrum is for mental health and well-being. Some women were scared that if they came out and just said they were struggling that day, that there would be some kind of repercussion, even though it may just be a daily thing and not an illness itself.
Okay.
One thing to bounce off of is that was once compared to breaking your leg, where once you're healed from a broken leg, you're fine to work, and it can be the same way with mental health. But many people view that if you struggled once, that you're going to struggle for a very long time and are not ready to serve.
Okay. I might have to make this the last question. While your study found that women managing their work-life balance had poorer well-being, do you think that experiences of gender or sexual discrimination might also undermine well-being?
Yes. Short answer, yes. Experiences of discrimination and harassment does have a huge impact on one's mental health and well-being. Yeah.
Okay.
And what we found too was that if it went undressed and if organizations or other people or managers didn't acknowledge that it was going on and tried to intervene about that in the future, that had an even greater impact on their mental health and well-being.
Yeah, bouncing off of that, it was also pretty shocking to hear some of the women said that they felt like they couldn't speak up about this discrimination because they would be called hysterical or be called crazy or names, and a troublemaker, specifically one woman said. So that again was something very shocking to hear.
Yeah. Look, I might bring this to a conclusion now, and there is a question here that's a bit more of a comment, and it's actually from one of our board members. And she says, I had a similar thought about the importance of developing emotional intelligence for leaders. I hadn't previously connected the direct connection between mental health and well-being and leadership in emotional intelligence so clearly. I think there's an opportunity for us or the Workwell Learning Network to consider how and when emotional intelligence skill development is offered and how this supports their confidence and ability in leading on good mental health and well-being. I think I'll just finish by saying that the Workwell Learning Network, which brings together people from all across the sector in Victoria to look at improving mental health and well-being for the sector, is actually focusing on leadership at the moment. And I think that this piece of research is going to be, a lot of those people have participated today, and I feel that this research is going to be very, very informative for them. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of the questions. I'm hoping that I can hang on to those questions when I close this webinar somehow, and I'll get the girls to answer them, and we will get back to people. But I will, girls, you can leave the screen there. So if you get back to me, then we will coordinate all of that. So I normally at this point in a presentation, I hand over something as a gift, a token of our appreciation to the girls. I can't do that today, I'm very sorry, but it has been an absolute pleasure to work with you, a pleasure to work with your advisors, Stephen and Fabio. And just to tell everybody later today, we will do some social media and we will put it into this presentation. And in the coming days, the girls will produce a sort of a summary brochure that will be available to everyone as well. So thank you very much, Alexis, Elizabeth, Manon and Krystina. And it's been a wonderful experience working with you from afar. So thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
Yeah, thank you all.
What an opportunity.